world where the Panama Canal is literally drying up and megaships are being turned away, Mexico just did the unthinkable. They deployed their military to seize a private railway, all to resurrect a century-old trade route. Now, with $5 billion already spent and China quietly circling, this bold move could flip global shipping upside down.
Even within a few years from now, after the project has been completed, it's not going to reach even half of the capacity that the Panama Canal allows the shipping companies to transit through the canal.
What's really going on down there? And why is the entire world suddenly watching Mexico? You're about to find out. The shipping world's breaking point. Global trade is heading towards a crisis most people never notice. The shipping infrastructure we depend on was engineered over a century ago, decades before container ships weighing 200,000 tons or annual trade volumes exceeding 12 billion tons. Today's megavessels have outgrown the waterways meant to guide them, and the world keeps demanding more than these old systems can deliver. International trade has exploded far faster than the canals and passages built in an earlier era can adapt, creating a dangerous mismatch between global demand and maritime capacity. That mismatch centers around maritime choke points, those narrow stretches of water where nearly all global trade must pass, and they're becoming the most fragile links in the world economy. One of the clearest warnings came in 2023, when the Panama Canal faced its worst drought in over 100 years. Water levels fell so low that authorities slashed daily ship crossings by massive margins, and ships that once planned precise schedules were suddenly stuck in lines stretching for miles, waiting not hours but days and sometimes weeks for a chance to pass. Shipping companies found themselves trapped between impossible choices: wait endlessly in a queue, or reroute thousands of miles around South America, burning more fuel, adding more time, and driving up costs for every product they move. The most unsettling part is that these problems aren't temporary but structural limits baked into the world's shipping backbone. Limits that will only tighten as demand grows and infrastructure continues aging. Every delay ripples outward into global supply chains, pushing up the price of electronics, groceries, clothing, construction materials, and everything people rely on. So the real question becomes unavoidable. What happens when the world's most important trade routes can no longer handle the volume they were never built for? And here's where most people assume the story ends: that we're stuck with what we have. But history has a funny way of repeating itself in unexpected places. The railway that almost changed everything. In 1907, 7 years before the Panama Canal even opened, Mexico was already moving cargo between the Atlantic and Pacific, and for a fleeting moment, the country seemed poised to control the future of global shipping. The vision came from President Porfirio Diaz in the late 1800s, who saw the narrow Isthmus of Tehuantepec as the perfect corridor to connect two oceans, and engineers built a railway across the strip of land, linking ports on either coast. By 1907, the first trains successfully hauled cargo along the corridor, and Mexico transformed almost overnight into a vital hub for international trade. Ships offloaded goods on the Gulf Coast. Trains carried them across hundreds of kilometers of jungle, mountains, and plains, and merchants on the Pacific side awaited the arrival of foreign and domestic products. Commerce surged, ports thrived, and for a brief window, Mexico held a permanent place at the center of global shipping. Then 1914 arrived. The Panama Canal opened, and Mexico's railway suddenly seemed small and obsolete. Cargo traffic through the railway corridor collapsed within months of the canal's opening, with the route quickly becoming commercially irrelevant. Ships no longer needed to unload because they sailed directly through the canal, a water-based shortcut that made the land corridor irrelevant overnight. It wasn't geography that failed Mexico, but the convergence of history, technology, and timing. The country's window closed before it could fully capitalize on its advantage. And the world moved on, leaving the railway to fade into memory. The railway rusted away for more than a century, forgotten by everyone except those who understood that geography doesn't change. Only the vision to harness it does. The $5 billion resurrection. In 2018, Mexico made a decision that stunned observers around the world. President Andrés Manuel López Obrador announced that the long-dead Interoceanic Corridor would rise again, but this time with a plan so massive that the original railway looked like a toy set in comparison. The project centered on 3 major railway lines stretching more than 1,000 kilometers, rebuilding and expanding the entire transportation spine across the isthmus, with brand new highways running beside them designed to move cargo at speeds the old corridor could never imagine. But the real shock came with the anchor feature. New deep water ports on both coasts, engineered from the ground up to handle the world's largest container ships, the same mega vessels that physically cannot squeeze through the Panama Canal's locks, no matter how advanced the canal becomes. These ports weren't renovations, but gateways meant to pull the world's shipping giants directly toward Mexico. And the operational vision was bold. A ship arriving from Asia could dock on the Pacific side, offload its containers onto high-capacity trains or trucks, cross the isthmus in a matter of hours, and reload onto another ship waiting in the Atlantic, eradicating the canal queues, lock delays, and size limitations, and the reverse trip would work the same way. The government committed $5 billion initially, with additional private investment expected as operations prove commercially viable. And because the project cut through one of Mexico's poorest regions, officials estimated it could create jobs, an economic shockwave capable of reshaping communities that had been left behind for generations. By December 2023, the corridor achieved its first major milestone when modern passenger trains began carrying travelers across the isthmus, connecting the Gulf Coast to the Pacific in just a few hours, and opening tourism opportunities in regions that had remained isolated for decades. Officially, the government insisted this corridor wasn't designed to replace the Panama Canal, but to diversify global trade routes and provide resilience when the canal faced disruptions. But inside the shipping industry, everyone understood the unspoken truth. If Mexico delivered a route that was faster and cheaper, companies would shift their cargo without hesitation. Because the resurrection of the corridor wasn't just a construction project, but a bet that geography, technology, and scale could finally align in Mexico's favor. But building something this ambitious in one of the world's most bureaucratic industries doesn't happen through polite requests and patient negotiations. When the Army gets involved, by 2020, disputes over railway infrastructure in the Isthmus region stalled construction. The government invoked legal authority to take control of critical rail sections needed for corridor completion. Then the government made a decision that stunned the nation. President López Obrador authorized the military to seize the railway. Soldiers arrived, took control of the disputed section, and effectively nationalized the infrastructure overnight, transforming a private asset into a strategic state possession. The backlash was immediate. Critics called it authoritarian. Opponents accused the administration of violating property rights, and business groups warned it could poison relationships with investors. But the government responded with a single argument. This corridor was a matter of national strategic importance, and no private entity would be allowed to threaten its completion. The moment revealed exactly where the project stood within Mexico's hierarchy of priorities. This wasn't simply infrastructure anymore, but a symbol of sovereignty, security, and economic destiny. And the message to the world was unmistakable. Delays would not be tolerated, and obstacles would be removed. For some observers, the intervention showed rare decisiveness in a country where bureaucracy often slows everything. In contrast, for others, it marked a worrying expansion of executive power. Still, both sides agreed on one reality. Mexico was all in, treating this corridor not as a commercial venture, but as a national mission. And with the obstacles cleared and construction accelerating, the world began asking the question that would determine everything. The numbers that rewrite global trade. The skepticism is understandable. How could lifting containers off a ship, hauling them across land, and loading them onto another vessel ever compete with a ship gliding through a waterway? For more than a century, global trade has revolved around the assumption that water routes are always the fastest and most efficient. But the numbers behind Mexico's corridor tell a completely different story. And once you see them, the entire calculation changes. Passing through the Panama Canal typically requires 8 to 10 hours for the crossing alone. And that figure doesn't include the waiting times that pile up during peak seasons. In some months, ships linger for days, and in extreme cases weeks, simply waiting for their turn inside the locks. The Mexican corridor flips this dynamic entirely because containers can move from the Atlantic to the Pacific or the reverse within a few hours, and the process involves minimal queuing. For shippers operating on tight schedules, those hours can mean the difference between meeting deadlines and missing them, and the cost savings compound quickly across thousands of shipments. The corridor becomes even more compelling for megaships. Many of the largest vessels afloat are too wide or too tall for Panama's locks, forcing them to sail thousands of miles around South America through some of the most dangerous waters on the planet. Mexico offers them a shortcut that avoids both size restrictions and extreme weather along the southern route, opening up entirely new routing possibilities that simply didn't exist before. Flexibility adds another dimension that canals can't match. The corridor's network includes multiple rail lines and highways running in parallel, so if one line undergoes maintenance or faces delays, others keep freight moving. This redundancy means the system is inherently more resilient than a single waterway, and unlike a canal, the Mexican route doesn't depend on rainfall. Panama's experience during drought years, when water levels forced strict traffic reductions, reveals how vulnerable water-based routes can be to climate disruptions that are only becoming more frequent. Early adoption numbers are already emerging. In 2024, the corridor handled its first commercial cargo shipments on a trial basis, with several mid-sized shipping companies testing the route for high-value electronics and automotive parts. The results showed transit times reduced by 30 to 40% compared to traditional Panama routing, and while these are small-scale tests, they represent proof of concept that the corridor can deliver on its core promise of speed and efficiency. The reality is that Mexico isn't trying to capture every ship, but aims for a specific segment: high-value cargo, time-sensitive shipments, and vessels where size constraints make the land crossing the smarter choice. This creates a tiered global shipping model where some ships still prefer Panama, while others shift toward Mexico's rising alternative. And industry observers suggest the corridor could eventually capture a meaningful share of trans-Pacific and transatlantic cargo flows as operations scale. But capturing that traffic requires more than fast transit times and deep-water ports, because the biggest test isn't about infrastructure. It's about convincing a notoriously conservative industry to change the way it's operated for over a century. The adoption challenge. Mexico has the infrastructure, but adoption isn't guaranteed. Shipping companies must overhaul logistics systems, retain staff, and coordinate between two ports, customs agencies, and inland transport networks. The corridor demands precise coordination between port arrivals, customs inspections, inland rail movements, and reloading on the opposite coast, and a misalignment in any one of these steps creates delays that erase the time savings. Customs adds complexity because moving freight through two ports and across national territory introduces more checkpoints than a straightforward canal transit. Technology becomes critical here, as tracking systems, automated scheduling, real-time monitoring, and secure digital documentation must work without failure. And Mexico has invested heavily in digital infrastructure to synchronize these moving parts. Because of these challenges, major companies are expected to begin with small pilot programs, testing the corridor with limited cargo, measuring outcomes, and assessing risks before expanding. This is where the network effect becomes decisive, because if a few industry leaders adopt the corridor and report success, others will follow simply to stay competitive. Mexico must also demonstrate daily operational excellence, efficient customs, consistent scheduling, reliable staffing, and smooth coordination between agencies and private operators. Security remains non-negotiable. Cargo must be protected, theft prevented, and law enforcement presence must be visible enough to reassure international partners. The Mexican government has deployed specialized security units along the corridor and implemented tracking systems that monitor every container from port to port, addressing concerns that have historically plagued cross-border land transport in the region. Even under optimistic conditions, full integration into global shipping networks could take years, with every major player watching for proof that the corridor works consistently, stays secure, and delivers the promised benefits. The stakes are enormous because success would establish Mexico as a major force in global trade, while failure would mean billions spent with little to show for it. But what's already clear is that the attempt itself has forced a conversation the shipping world has avoided for decades. While companies weigh their options and Mexico refines its operations, something fundamental has already shifted in how the world thinks about moving goods between oceans. The geopolitical earthquake nobody saw coming. Mexico's corridor isn't just challenging the Panama Canal. It's rewriting the geopolitical map of global trade in ways that reach far beyond shipping logistics, and the implications are only starting to become clear. For over a century, control of the Panama Canal has been a matter of strategic importance for the United States, which originally built it, controlled it for decades, and still considers the Caribbean and Central America within its sphere of influence. Now Mexico, a country that has historically played a secondary role in regional trade infrastructure, is positioning itself as a genuine alternative. And that shift carries weight that extends into diplomacy, economics, and international power dynamics. China has been watching this development closely. Over the past decade, Chinese shipping companies have become some of the largest users of the Panama Canal, and Beijing has invested billions in port infrastructure throughout Latin America. A Mexican corridor that can handle the massive cargo volumes flowing between Asia and North America represents an opportunity for China to diversify its supply chains and reduce dependence on a single choke point that could be disrupted by political tensions or natural disasters. Container volumes from China to Mexico increased by over 61% between January and June 2024, fueling the speculation that Chinese state-owned shipping firms have already begun discussions with Mexican officials about long-term usage agreements for the corridor. Maritime analytics data shows this shift is reshaping North American supply chains, with Mexico increasingly positioned as a major cargo gateway. The United States faces a complex calculation. On one hand, a more resilient North American trade network benefits American companies that depend on efficient supply chains. On the other hand, a stronger, more economically independent Mexico changes the regional balance, and if Chinese investment flows heavily into the corridor, it could create a situation where Beijing gains influence over a critical piece of infrastructure on America's southern border. U.S. officials have publicly emphasized North American supply chain integration through high-level diplomatic engagement with Mexico on trade infrastructure. For Mexico itself, the corridor represents something even more profound: economic sovereignty. For generations, the country has been economically overshadowed by its northern neighbor and dependent on external markets for its prosperity. The corridor offers a chance to become a critical node in global commerce, generating revenue, creating jobs, and building infrastructure that serves Mexican interests first. President López Obrador has framed the project in exactly these terms, calling it a restoration of Mexico's rightful place in the world economy. But the geopolitical implications extend beyond the major powers. Central American countries, particularly Panama, are facing the prospect of reduced canal revenues if traffic diverts northward. Panama's economy is heavily dependent on canal fees, and even a modest shift in shipping volumes could force the country to make difficult budgetary decisions. This has sparked regional discussions about cooperation versus competition, with some analysts suggesting that a network of complementary routes could serve everyone's interests better than a zero-sum battle for market share. What's emerging is a new era where trade routes are no longer fixed but fluid, where nations compete to offer the fastest, cheapest, most reliable options, and where geopolitical influence flows to whoever controls the most efficient pathways between markets. Mexico's corridor has accelerated this transformation, forcing governments and corporations alike to rethink assumptions that have held for a century. And that transformation is just beginning, because the question is no longer whether alternatives to traditional choke points will emerge, but how quickly they'll reshape the entire architecture of global commerce. The world that comes next. Mexico's corridor has already accomplished something that seemed impossible just a decade ago. It ended the world's century-long dependence on a single path between oceans. Whether the corridor captures 5% or 50% of transoceanic traffic, the fundamental shift has already occurred because global trade now operates with options, redundancy, and alternatives that didn't exist before, and that changes everything. The immediate future looks like this. By 2026, the corridor is projected to be operating at full capacity, with both deepwater ports completed and all 3 rail lines fully integrated into global logistics networks. Shipping companies will have spent years testing the route, refining their procedures, and building relationships with Mexican operators. Early adopters who took the risk will have gained competitive advantages in speed and cost, forcing their competitors to follow or lose market share. By 2030, projections suggest the corridor could handle tens of millions of tons of cargo annually as operations mature. That volume would generate billions in revenue for Mexico, fund ongoing infrastructure expansion, and establish the country as an indispensable player in global shipping. The economic transformation in southern Mexico would be equally dramatic, with new industrial zones, logistics hubs, and manufacturing centers emerging along the corridor to take advantage of the connectivity. But the real story isn't the numbers, it's the precedent. Mexico has demonstrated that with sufficient political will, strategic investment, and bold execution, it's possible to challenge entrenched infrastructure monopolies that have shaped global commerce for generations. Other regions are already watching and learning. The competition this creates will benefit everyone. The Panama Canal will be forced to innovate, modernize, and improve efficiency to remain competitive. Shipping companies will have leverage to negotiate better terms. Supply chains will become more resilient because no single disruption, whether drought, political instability, or natural disaster, can shut down global trade. And nations that have historically been bypassed by major trade routes will have examples to follow, blueprints for how geography can be transformed into economic power. There are legitimate concerns that can't be ignored. Environmental impact remains a critical question, as massive infrastructure projects inevitably affect ecosystems, water resources, and wildlife. Mexico will need to demonstrate that development can coexist with conservation, that economic growth doesn't require environmental destruction. Community displacement and cultural preservation matter as well, because the regions being transformed have their own histories, traditions, and ways of life that deserve protection. But if Mexico navigates these challenges successfully, if the corridor proves both economically viable and environmentally responsible, if it delivers on the promise of shared prosperity rather than extractive development, then it becomes a model for how 21st century infrastructure can serve both commerce and communities. That's the real test, and it will take decades to fully evaluate. What we're witnessing right now is the early stages of a transformation that will define global trade for the next century. The world that relied on a single canal, a single route, and a single geographic choke point is gone. The world that comes next is one where nations compete to offer the best pathways, where trade flows through multiple channels, and where infrastructure becomes a tool for reshaping economic and political power. Mexico shocked the world not by building something impossible, but by doing what everyone assumed would never happen, taking on an entrenched system and offering a genuine alternative. What do you think? Will Mexico's corridor stabilize global trade or trigger new power struggles? Share your thoughts below and subscribe for more on the transformation of global commerce. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.